The world knew Vice President George H.W. Bush as the quintessential loyal number two. He was the patrician shadow, the moderate, well-bred counterpoint to Ronald Reagan's folksy revolutionary fire. He was a man defined by his deference, his service, his unwavering, almost aristocratic loyalty. But on March 30th, 1981, at precisely 2:27 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, that definition became utterly irrelevant. As 6 bullets tore through the damp spring air outside the Washington Hilton, the man who was supposed to be in charge was being shoved into a limousine, a froth of blood on his lips, and the man who was next in line was 200 miles away, suspended between earth and sky on a Texas tarmac, holding a copy of a constitution that seemed, for one terrifying afternoon, to be failing. The immediate chaos was not just about a wounded president. It was about a terrifying absolute power vacuum, and 3 men, a president fighting for his life, an ambitious Secretary of State sensing an opportunity, and a vice president trapped on Air Force 2, would determine if the United States government would survive the next 8 hours. Before we unravel the secrets, the whispers and the backroom power plays of that day, if you are drawn to the untold stories of power and the figures who defined our era, consider subscribing to our channel. We are dedicated to uncovering the complex history you only thought you knew. In Dallas, Texas, the day had been bright, optimistic, and comfortingly mundane. George H.W. Bush was in high spirits. He had just delivered a speech to the Dallas-Fort Worth Regional Airport Board, a standard low-stakes appearance that was the bread and butter of the vice presidency. This was the comfortable, predictable rhythm of his new role. It was a role he understood deeply, perhaps better than any who had come before him. He had served in the shadows of power for decades, as the youngest combat pilot in World War II, as a congressman, as UN ambassador, as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He was a man who knew precisely where every lever of power was, even if he wasn't allowed to pull them. He was wrapping up, preparing for a short flight to Austin for his next engagement, another speech, another handshake. He boarded the gleaming blue and white jet, Air Force 2, and the engines began their familiar, reassuring whine. It was in that mundane, liminal moment as the cabin door was being sealed that an aide scrambled up the steps, his face pale, his hand held up. The first report was chaotic, fragmented, the kind of report that chills the blood. Shots fired in Washington. The engines were immediately cut. The silence that fell over the cabin was deafening, heavier than the whine it replaced. Suddenly, the most technologically advanced aircraft in the world felt like a tin can. A coffin. Bush was ushered into the small onboard stateroom, the secure phone lines crackling to life. The information was contradictory, terrifying. Was Reagan hit? Was it a lone gunman or something bigger? Those who lived through the paranoia of the 1960s and 70s, who remembered exactly where they were when Kennedy was shot, understood this was not just an assassination attempt. It was the potential start of World War III. Was this a KGB operation? Was it a coordinated strike? Was the government being systematically decapitated? George Bush, the ex-CIA director, understood this complex, layered threat better than anyone. He was isolated, 1,200 miles from the Situation Room, and for all he knew, he was already the acting president of the United States. His calm, patrician exterior, the famous preppy demeanor, masked a cold, analytical dread. The next move wasn't just political, it was existential. But back in Washington, someone else was already making a move. While Bush was still trying to get a clear line, Secretary of State Alexander Haig, a 4-star general with a towering ego and a deep-seated belief in his own destiny, was striding purposefully toward the White House Situation Room. Haig was a man of the 70s, a survivor of the Nixon-Watergate siege, a man who saw chaos as a ladder. He saw the vacuum and he intended to fill it. He was not going to wait for the man he privately, and sometimes publicly, dismissed as a wimp. He burst into the Situation Room, his presence filling the cramped, windowless space. The atmosphere was already electric with fear. Haig's arrival turned it into a thunderstorm. He gathered the available cabinet members, Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, and others, and it was then, in a moment that would define his entire career, that he slammed his hand on the table. He was about to make a statement that would very nearly trigger a constitutional crisis, all while the vice president, the actual man in charge, was still strapped to a seat in Texas fighting for a clear signal. The tension in that room was unbearable. To understand the chaos of the next few hours, one must understand the 25th Amendment. It was a document designed for clarity in the nuclear age, ratified after Kennedy's assassination. But in the fog of war, it was dangerously vague. It outlined how a president could declare himself disabled, or how a vice president and the cabinet could together declare him unable to serve. But Reagan was on a gurney, being rushed into surgery at George Washington University Hospital, in no condition to sign anything. And in that power vacuum, Alexander Haig saw himself as the de facto man in charge. He was, in his mind, the vicar of foreign policy, the man who stood next to the president. He turned to the press and to history and uttered the words that would haunt him forever. The helm is right here, and that means right here, with me, constitutionally, until the vice president gets here. He was, of course, completely and spectacularly wrong. The line of succession was clear, painfully clear to every high school civics student. President, Vice President, Speaker of the House, and then the Secretary of State. This was the dramatic, personal ambition clashing with constitutional fact. Haig was a general, a man of action, and he believed the country needed a visible commander. The media broadcasting his frantic, sweating press conference live amplified the panic. Who was flying the plane? Those watching this unfold live on television remember the profound, gut-wrenching uncertainty. They had lived through Kennedy, through King, through Vietnam. And now this. The stock market was plummeting. The military, specifically the Strategic Air Command, was put on a higher state of alert, their fingers moving closer to the nuclear triggers. And all the while, George H.W. Bush was finally in the air, his engines at full throttle, hurtling back toward a capital city that seemed to be coming apart at the seams, led by a man who had just declared a soft, televised coup. The flight from Dallas to Washington, normally a mundane commute, had just become the most important flight of his life. Aboard Air Force Two, George H.W. Bush was in a bubble of pressurized calm hurtling toward the storm. He was now getting more reliable and more horrifying information. Reagan was in surgery. He had been hit under the arm, the bullet collapsing his lung. He was, for all intents and purposes, completely incapacitated. This was it. This was the moment every vice president prepares for and prays will never come. But Bush's training was all about loyalty, secrecy, and the avoidance of panic. He knew Alexander Haig's personality intimately. He knew that his rival, the man he had frequently clashed with in internal meetings, was now alone in the Situation Room. He understood, perhaps better than Haig himself, the image that was being broadcast to the world, and far more importantly to the Soviets. He knew that in Moscow, analysts at the KGB were analyzing Haig's every word, his sweat, his frantic energy, looking for weakness, looking for an opportunity. Those who had spent their entire lives under the shadow of the mushroom cloud understood this unspoken terror. A decapitated American government was the prelude to a Soviet first strike. This was Bush's internal, agonizing struggle. He was the constitutional authority, but he could not appear to seize it. To do so would confirm the panic, to make it look like a coup was being met with a counter-coup. He sat in his stateroom, the secure phone pressed to his ear, listening to the chaos unfold in Washington. The reports from the Situation Room were becoming more alarming. It wasn't just Haig. Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, was, according to witnesses, furious. He had heard Haig's "I am in control" statement and openly challenged him. The two men were nearly at each other's throats. The military chain of command was, at that moment, dangerously close to fracturing, with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense issuing contradictory signals. This was the true factual crisis. The government was eating itself alive. Bush, the former CIA director, knew that this infighting was more dangerous than the lone gunman. It was this internal rot that the Soviets were trained to exploit. He had to get there. He had to restore the chain of command. But how he arrived would determine if he succeeded. It was then that George H.W. Bush made a crucial defining decision, one that baffled some of his younger, more aggressive aides. An aide suggested that they should arrange for Marine One, the presidential helicopter, to meet Air Force Two at Andrews Air Force Base. It would be the fastest way to get to the White House. More importantly, it would be a powerful visual. The vice president landing on the South Lawn, striding into the Oval Office, taking charge. It was what Haig would have done. Bush, however, immediately and firmly refused. He instructed the pilot not to land on the White House South Lawn. That was the president's helicopter, the president's arrival. To use it, he reasoned, would look like an ascension, an eager grab for power. It would make him look like a usurper. Instead, he would land at Andrews Air Force Base and take the slow, standard vice presidential motorcade. This was a masterful piece of political theater, a signal of profound loyalty that was also, in its own way, a profound assertion of control. He was communicating to the entire government, and to the world, that the government was stable, that the line of succession was respected, and that he was not Alexander Haig. But as Reagan was wheeled into the operating theater at George Washington University Hospital, a horrifying discovery was made. The bullet was not a simple round. It was a .22 caliber Devastator round, a bullet specifically designed to fragment on impact, to tumble and tear through soft tissue. The bullet had missed his heart by less than an inch. This was the fact that defined the medical drama. He was not just shot, he was critically wounded by a munition designed to inflict maximum damage. The surgeons, led by Dr. Joseph Giordano, were now in a desperate race against time. The president was losing blood and fast. This news, when it was relayed in whispers to the Situation Room, only deepened the panic. The man who Haig had just declared was recovering was, in fact, on the brink of death. And as this new, terrible reality was dawning on the men in the bunker, George H.W. Bush's plane, Air Force Two, was finally breaking through the clouds over Maryland. He was descending from his quiet, analytical bubble and flying directly into this feverish political cauldron. He was landing, and he was walking into a room with a man who believed he was king. Around 7 p.m., after 8 agonizing hours, George H.W. Bush's motorcade finally swept through the gates of the White House. The atmosphere was funereal, tense. Aides lined the hallways, their faces drawn and gray, looking for reassurance from a man who had been in the sky. Bush walked with a long, purposeful stride, his lanky frame cutting through the tension. He entered the Situation Room. The room, as described by those present, was thick with cigar smoke and the metallic taste of exhausted fear. It went silent. All eyes turned to him. There sat Alexander Haig at the end of the long table, looking defiant. There sat Caspar Weinberger, the man who had openly disputed Haig's authority just hours earlier. This was the climax. This was the moment where dramatic speculation meets historical fact. No one knew what he would do. Would he reprimand Haig? Would he clear the room? Would he publicly assert his authority? George H.W. Bush did something brilliant, something that no one, especially not Haig, had anticipated. He walked to the center of the table, to the chair reserved for the vice president. He did not take Ronald Reagan's seat at the head of the table. He calmly unbuttoned his suit jacket, sat down, opened his folder, and looked around the room. His voice was even, low and steady. "Well," he began, "let's get an update on the president's condition. Then I want a full report from each of you on your department's status." It was over. In that single quiet gesture, Bush had taken complete, absolute control of the United States government without ever raising his voice. He hadn't seized power. He had assumed responsibility. He reestablished the chain of command, diffused Haig's power play without humiliating him, and projected an aura of absolute, unshakable calm. The crisis, the constitutional ambiguity, evaporated. The government was functioning. This was Bush's personal test. His reputation as a man of action was already well known. But this was a different kind of courage. This was the courage of stillness, of restraint. For the next several hours, he was the presidency. He sat at that table, managing the inputs, the military, the cabinet, the nervous allies calling from London, Bonn, and Tokyo. He was caught between his profound personal loyalty to Reagan, a man he genuinely admired, and his sacred, impersonal duty to the nation. This dramatic element is the core of his character. Would the loyal man be strong enough to lead? His every move was a signal to the Soviets. His every calm question was a quiet rebuke to Haig's earlier panic. This was not a power grab. It was a power restoration. He was, in effect, performing the presidency so that the presidency itself would not fail. The press corps, specifically the anchormen who were the gods of the 1980s, were still feeding the nation's anxiety. Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, Frank Reynolds. These men were the high priests of the era, and their every word shaped the reality for those watching at home. Bush knew this. Part of his strategy in the Situation Room was to control the narrative. He had designated James Brady, the press secretary, to be the sole source of information. But Brady was himself tragically wounded in the shooting, fighting for his life, just rooms away from the president. That vacuum was what had allowed Haig to self-immolate on national television. Now Bush had to reclaim that narrative. He authorized his own staff quietly to give off-the-record assurances to the press. The VP is in charge. The government is stable. The president is in recovery. It was a subtle, brilliant move. He was using the very media that had fanned the flames of panic to now put them out, all while never appearing on camera himself. He was the invisible hand steadying the ship. He understood that the real battle was not just for the Situation Room. It was for the confidence of the American people and the fear of their enemies. The climax of this 8-hour ordeal was not a bang, but a series of whispers. First, the call from the hospital. Reagan was awake. He was stable. He was joking. His famous line to his wife Nancy, "Honey, I forgot to duck," had already been relayed. The relief in the Situation Room was physical, palpable. Men slumped in their chairs, the adrenaline of 8 hours draining away, leaving them gray and exhausted. But the political climax was yet to come. Bush, having ensured the government was running, now faced his final and perhaps most important test: handing power back. This is where speculation becomes vital. Lesser men, perhaps even Haig, might have held on. They might have made a public speech from the Oval Office, taken a victory lap, cemented their newfound authority. Bush, true to his skull-and-bones code of loyalty, simply faded back. He prepared to leave the White House. But not before one final, quiet, and deeply symbolic encounter. According to witnesses, he passed Alexander Haig in the hallway. No harsh words were exchanged. Bush simply nodded, "Al," and Haig, defeated, nodded back. The battle was over. Bush had won, precisely because he had refused to fight. The world would not know the full extent of George Bush's leadership that day for decades. The public narrative, the one that settled over the 1980s like a comfortable blanket, was simple. Reagan was a courageous hero who joked in the face of death, and Bush was the loyal deputy who kept the lights on. This narrative perfectly suited the desire for stability and heroism in that era. But recently declassified records and insider accounts, which provide the factual backbone of this story, paint a far more complex and profound picture. They show that Bush was the one who personally coordinated with the military to lower the defense condition, DEFCON status. While Haig was shouting at the press and Weinberger was arguing about the chain of command, Bush, on the phone from Air Force 2, was asking the calm, critical questions. What is our status? What is the Soviet posture? He was the one who, upon landing, confirmed the order to stand down, pulling the world back from a potential nuclear precipice that Haig's panic had nudged it towards. He had not just run a cabinet meeting, he had actively prevented an escalation of the Cold War. In the immediate aftermath, his final act was one of profound, calculated loyalty. He returned to the vice president's residence, the Admiral's house. He intentionally, pointedly avoided the Oval Office. He would not sit in that chair. He would not sleep in the president's bed, not until he was elected to it. This was the legacy anxiety of a man steeped in history. The final mystery of that day is not what Bush did, but what he thought. Did those 8 hours change him? Did the man who flew back to Washington as a deferential deputy land as a future president, now certain of his own destiny? The historical record shows he resumed his duties without fanfare. But the dramatic speculative truth is that in those 8 hours, he had looked into the abyss. He had seen the caliber of men who stood near the top, men like Haig. And he had confirmed to himself and to the insiders who mattered that he was the one capable of standing at the edge without flinching. The wimp label, the one that had haunted him for years, had been burned away in the crucible of that crisis. The resolution was the morning of March 31st. The sun rose over Washington. The stock market, which had been frozen in terror, stabilized. The world, which had teetered on the brink, found its footing. Ronald Reagan was recovering, and George H.W. Bush was, once again, simply the vice president. He had taken the wheel of a 747 in a nosedive, stabilized it, and quietly handed the controls back to the pilot. This narrative became the unspoken bedrock of his 1988 campaign. He didn't need to say he was presidential. He had been presidential when it mattered most. Those who lived through the Morning in America optimism remember the Reagan years as a time of strength. But that strength was almost extinguished on its 70th day. It was saved not by a cowboy, but by a quiet, calculating aristocrat who understood that true power is not about being the loudest man in the room, but the calmest. His performance that day healed the national trauma of Dallas in 1963. It proved that the 25th Amendment, that the system, actually worked. The legacy is clear and multifaceted. Those 8 hours were the crucible of the Bush presidency. They proved his competence not just to the public, but to the skeptical Washington insiders, the Beltway crowd who had always doubted him. He had faced down his arrogant rival, Alexander Haig, without a fight. Haig, in fact, would never recover. His political career was effectively over, a victim of his own hubris. Bush, conversely, had solidified his position as the undisputed heir. He had managed a cabinet of massive clashing egos. He had calmed a terrified nation, and he had protected the authority of the president he served. The final truth is this. The facts are that he flew home, held a meeting, and stabilized the government. The dramatic speculative truth is that in those 8 hours, he navigated a silent coup, a potential nuclear escalation, and his own internal demons of self-doubt, emerging as the man who would one day inevitably lead the world. The day Reagan was shot was the day George H.W. Bush truly and irreversibly became president. His 8-year wait for the Oval Office was just a formality. He had already passed the test.